Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Veteran Technical Assistance Center's webinar series. Our webinar today is on stand-down financing. We have a lot of great information for you. My name is Cindy Borden. I'm the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance and Training for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, NCHV, and we are one part of the National Veterans Technical Assistance Center with our partners, Advocates for Human Potential. We're really excited today. We have Shirley Snyder, who's the Competitive Grants Analyst for the Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Service, and she'll be a guest speaker in just a few minutes. Before we turn things over to Shirley, I just want to start with a little bit of logistical information. As you may have figured out by now, your phone lines are muted. You will not be able to ask questions through the phone during the webinar, and that's to avoid feedback and other disturbances that sometimes happen when the phone lines are open. You will be able to ask questions, though, through the questions bar on your screen or the chat function. Either of those will work, and we will leave time at the end of the webinar to make sure that we answer some of those questions. So please feel free to ask questions through either of those methods throughout the webinar itself. There will also be a post-webinar survey that will pop up immediately after the webinar ends, and it will also come to you in an email later today or tomorrow. Please take a few minutes to complete that survey to let us know how helpful the webinar was, whether it was useful or not, and also if you have additional questions after the webinar, you can post them in that survey as well. There's a question there, a space to do that. As I said, we will have questions throughout. I will be gathering the questions throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure we have time at the end to answer as many of those as possible. Just to go over briefly what our agenda is for today, we already did the logistical piece of things, so we can check that one item off the agenda already. We're going to talk a little bit about the background and vision for stand-downs to provide a little bit of context. Many of you may have participated in a webinar that we did in January on stand-down development. In that webinar, we went into a lot more detail about the background of stand-downs and how they came to be and how you go about planning one. And I encourage you, if you haven't seen that webinar, to go and review that in its entirety. It is available on our website, www.nchv.org. You can see the webinar in its entirety there. We will, after we talk a little bit about background and vision, we're going to talk about the federal agencies that support stand-down, and specifically today we're going to be talking about stand-down supports through DOL-VETS and how you can apply for funding the financial side of supporting your stand-down. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what a stand-down is. A stand-down is a 1 to 3 day event, and it's geared towards homeless individuals and their families, both veterans and non-veterans. It is led by community service providers, local organizations, as well as the VA medical centers locally. And the founders of stand-down were two men, Robert Van Kuren and Dr. John Natchison, and they were in San Diego, and with the support of an organization there called Vietnam Veterans of San Diego. It's now Veterans Village of San Diego. The name has changed. But back in 1988, they started stand-downs, and it was really a community-led event. And the purpose of the stand-down is, the whole philosophy behind the stand-down is, it's a hand up, it's not a hand out. The stand-down gets its name from a concept that started in times of war, and specifically in this case in the Vietnam War, where your combat units, when they were exhausted and needed to rest, they were told to stand down, and they left the battlefield and went sort of behind the lines to a place that was relatively safe and secure. And at these secure base camps, the troops were able to, take care of things, clean their uniforms, take care of personal hygiene, shower, get a hot meal, get medical care if they needed it, get letters from home, and also enjoy camaraderie and connection with their fellow soldiers in a safe environment. And that's really the heart of what a stand-down is. It's giving veterans the opportunity to feel connected to each other and to a time and a place where they felt safe and where they felt part of things. So when you think about homeless veterans, in many cases they're living on the streets, or perhaps they're in a shelter, but they really need a place to sort of connect and feel safe from that. And that's what the Stand Down offers. That Stand Down event gives them a place to come together with their friends, with their comrades, and connect back to a time when they felt good about themselves during their military service, but also when they felt safe. And then as part of that, we are giving them access to various resources, but the veterans don't keep coming back to Stand Downs year after year just for the resources. They come back for that connection and that feeling, and again, that hand-up philosophy that is really important. So when we're thinking about stand downs, the part of the idea behind a stand down is we're providing services that veterans and homeless veterans in particular need. And so if you look at this slide here, what I've got here is the top 10 highest unmet needs of both male veterans and female veterans. This is taken from the 2015 challenge report, but the data is based on the 2014 data. That there's a one-year lag there. But you can see what some of the top needs. Now, these are the needs that are unmet. And it's things like legal assistance for eviction and child care, and family reconciliation, and discharge upgrades, and financial assistance, credit counseling, dental care, you can see on the number 9 on the female veteran side. So what we're trying to do is match the services that we're providing in a stand down with the needs of the veterans that are coming to that stand down. So some of the kinds of services that are offered typically at a stand down are access to housing, permanent, transitional, emergency, immediate housing, and we'll talk a little bit about when you're applying for funding from DOL, the requirement is that you have some kind of access to emergency shelter for those veterans who need it. Nutritional meals, essential health care and hygiene, access to mental health care or substance abuse care, personal development, empowerment, job assessment, employment, training services, access to child care, and access to legal assistance as well. Now, some of these services may be offered at your stand down specifically. Some of them may be referrals for care that's provided after the stand down, but the initial connection is made at the stand down itself. So today, since we're talking about stand down financing, I just wanted to spend just a second to talk about some of the agencies that do support stand downs. Primarily today, we're focusing on the DOL-VETS grant that I mentioned at the beginning, and we'll be going into quite a bit of detail about how to apply for those grants. But the VA homeless programs and the VA medical centers also support stand downs as well. And I will give an update at the end about accessing surplus goods through the VA. And then the last link here is to the stand down registry that's on the NCHV website. The founders of stand down actually asked NCHV to be the guardians of the stand down event and the history of that event. And so we do keep a registry of events that are happening, so you can look on our website and see local events that are coming up if you want to participate, if you want to talk to organizers, those sorts of things. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that as you can see on this slide here, is the veteran here is in the middle, and you can see around them are a bunch of different types of services: legal services, training, supportive services, employment, housing. Those services are all surrounding the veteran. The idea is that the veteran is the center of the service, and the veteran is driving the service. And those services are there to support the veteran in a connected and holistic way to provide the veteran whatever he or she might need in terms of services. It's not the services driving the veteran, it's the veteran driving the services. And the veteran should be the center of all of the services and all of the things that we're providing. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Shirley Snyder. As I mentioned, she's the competitive grants analyst for DOL-VETS, and Shirley's going to go through a little bit of information about the application for stand-down financing from DOL-VETS. Shirley?
Thank you, Cindy. Now, Cindy has gone over what is a stand-down, but what is even more important is why do a stand-down? And basically what we're trying to do is to assist with the reintegration of veterans and homeless veterans into the labor force through programs that would enhance employment and training opportunities and promote self-efficiency. Now, when we look at the funding amount and the timelines, again, one day is $7,000 for a one-day event. You can do up to 3 days, which is $10,000. Now, grants must be awarded to multiple, or it can be awarded to multiple organizations in the same general area, so as long as there is no commingling of federal funds. And what that basically means is if you had a grantee that received 3 stand-down awards for $7,000, that's $21,000. However, each one of those grants must stand alone. You cannot commingle those funds. Also, you can do multiple grants, and they can be awarded to the same organization. And again, but they must be in different geographical locations. Now, when you talk about stand-down events, next slide. The stand-downs are community-based and provide a variety of immediate services, which Cindy had mentioned earlier. But it's also important to remember that most stand-downs are all volunteer efforts and an outreach effort that provides a safe haven for homeless veterans. Cindy went over what the typical services are. It could be clothing, showers, haircut, legal services, employment and training opportunities. Next slide. However, the critical service that holds those guys together is that catalyst that enable those homeless veterans to get back into the mainstream society. This is considered an outreach effort for homeless veterans reintegration program purposes. The next slide, if anyone is actually interested in doing a stand-down or just want general information on a stand-down, you can go to the Federal Register notice, which I'm giving the address if you're interested, and submit your stand-down funding to a grant officer technical representative, which is a GOTAR, which is also the name for the DVET in the states, and there's also the state directory there. If you have questions or concerns, this is your contact. Nothing comes to the national office without going through that particular person. Next slide. You have your allowable expenses that are normally at the stand-downs, and also Cindy went over them. There's more on the second slide. And again, if you question anything, again, go back to that DVET. And on that last slide there, you're showing also what is disallowed. Next slide. Next slide. These, if you question what cannot be allowed, you can go to the Uniform Guidance, which is 2 CFR, Part 200. It even gives you a more detailed breakdown. Again, questions or concerns, please reach out to your DVET and within your particular state. Next slide, Cindy. And finally, if you need additional information, there's a website there for the Department of Labor, the VETS agency.
Thank you, Shirley. We appreciate that. I'm going to have you hold on the line. We may have some questions for you a little bit later. Just to answer one question that's come through from a couple of folks, the slides for the presentation will be available. They will will be posted on our website within the next day or two. We are also recording the webinar in its entirety, and you'll be able to get a link to that. We'll provide a link to the webinar, and you'll be able to watch the whole thing again if you so desire, or to share with other folks. So what I want to talk a little bit now is really get into the details of how you can go about applying for funding for your stand-down from the Department of Labor. The first thing to know is that stand-down funding is a non-competitive grant award. That means it's awarded on a first-come, first-served basis until the available funding is gone. So it's not a competitive grant where you're competing against other folks for a pot of money. It is first-come, first-served, assuming you meet the requirements of the grant until that funding goes away. There's up to about $600,000 available for this fiscal year, which equates to about 70 events. That's what DOL thinks it would be about this year. And as Shirley mentioned, for multi-day events, you can request up to $10,000 in funding. For a one-day event, you can request up to $7,000. The stand-down funding runs on a fiscal year system. It runs on the federal fiscal year. So the beginning of the year is October 1st, and the end of the year is September 30th. So right now, VETS is currently accepting applications for fiscal year 2015, which would end on September 30th of 2015. The funding for each year for the following year is dependent on congressional appropriation, so that does vary, but generally speaking, it is that about $600,000. For the purpose of the stand-down, applicants have to demonstrate that the grant money is going to go for rent or goods and services for homeless veterans. That does not mean that your stand-down can't reach veterans and non-homeless veterans as well as homeless veterans, but you do need to show in your application that the funding from DOL-VETS is going towards homeless veterans. The authorization for the stand-down funding comes from Section 2021, and basically you can read the direct there, but it's, as Shirley had mentioned, the purpose here is to reintegrate homeless veterans into the labor force. That's the purpose of the funding. So who is eligible to apply for stand-down funding? State workforce agencies, state and local workforce investment boards, veteran service organizations, tribes and tribal governments, local public agencies, that includes states and counties and cities, nonprofit organizations, including faith-based organizations. The folks who are not eligible are anyone who is registered as a 501c4 organization with the IRS, and that is basically a lobbying organization. So if you're a nonprofit that does lobbying and your IRS status is 501c4, you are not eligible to apply for the grant. All of those other types of entities are eligible. You do need to have a DUNS number, and there's the website there for how to get that. And you also need to register with the System for Award Management, affectionately known as SAM. In your application for stand-down funding, there's a few minimum services or sort of required necessary services called core services that have to be part of your application. The first is that you have to connect to the American Job Center, your local American Job Center, and or the DVOP, the Disabled Veterans Outreach Program Specialist, who is assigned to that job center. So you do need to have that connection there, and there is a link there, and I'll provide more resources later about how to find those folks. You also have to connect to the VA, to your local VA, for medical services, mental health services, and benefits access. That's required. And the third required piece is that you are connecting those homeless veterans who come to your stand-down to emergency housing. So those are your core services that have to be part of your stand-down in order to be eligible for DOL funding. As Shirley mentioned, there's a number of services that are allowable expenses, things that you can spend the money on. Again, the key here is that these things have to be for homeless veterans who are attending your stand down. So if your stand down is open to homeless and non-homeless veterans alike, you need to build in a way to track how the homeless veterans are receiving the services that DOL funding is paying for. So DOL funding can pay for goods and food for your homeless veterans. So bottles of water, non-perishable foods, clothing, sleeping bags, hygiene kits, non-prescription reading glasses. Any prescription reading glasses would have to be referred through the VA Medical Center. DOL funds cannot pay for prescription reading glasses. It can pay for vouchers, things like gasoline or food vouchers. Those gift cards, if they're for a gasoline gift card or a food gift card, have to only be able to be used for that purpose. So it can't be a gift card like a Visa gift card that could be used for anything. It has to be specific to those things. You can also pay for security personnel for your events through DOL funding. You can pay for employment supports like job searching things, stuff like that. You can also pay for one-time costs that support the event itself. So for renting the tents or providing electricity and porta potties, having internet access at your stand down, if you need janitorial supplies or cooking supplies, those kinds of things. Those are all allowable expenses. Advertising isn't an allowable expense, but it can't be more than 20% of the budget that you're requesting. You can provide transportation. So there's a lot of things that you can cover that this money can be used to cover, but again, make sure that it's services for homeless veterans. You need to pay attention to the date of your notice of award if you're awarded funding, because you cannot cover funds, you cannot cover things that happened before that. So the allowable expenses can be either 120 days before the event is to take place, so 120 days before your stand down, or a specific date that's identified in your timeline. So you need to pay attention that you're not making a lot of expenses and paying down a lot of costs for your stand down before the award comes through or before that 120-day period, because then it will not be an allowable expense under the grant. As Shirley mentioned, there's also some things that cannot be included that cannot be covered under DOL funding. Administrative costs or staff costs. So any of the, as Shirley mentioned, a lot of stand downs are run by volunteers and done with volunteer time, but your agency may have significant staff costs associated with running the stand down itself, and those are not allowable expenses for DOL. It also can't be used for giveaways. As I mentioned before, it can't be used for healthcare expenses like prescription eyewear and dental work. Those types of services need to be coordinated with the VA Medical Center and provided through that. And anything else that's not specifically approved by the DVET, that Shirley mentioned earlier, who is your initial contact when you're applying for your grant. So the application process itself. So DOL-VETS publishes a funding notice in the Federal Register notice. This year that occurred at the end of December. I believe it was right around Christmas this year. There's a link there to the Federal Register notice itself. Please go in and read that thoroughly. What we've tried to do in this webinar is capture all of the key pieces from that Federal Register notice, but please go in and read that. It's really important. You need to contact your State Director for Veterans Employment and Training, your DVET, for questions about their timelines or anything like that. There's a link there, and Shirley had mentioned them earlier as well, to help you find the contact information for your State Director so that you can contact that person. So The notice has been published, and so you can go in and actually download those materials. Once you go through that, and we're going to go into what the application itself looks like in just a minute, but you download the instructions and your application, you complete your application, and you send it to your appropriate DVET. You need to do that 90 days before the date of your stand down. In just a minute, I'm going to show you a timeline, and it is in the handouts here that you can download and save for yourself that will help keep track of the various times and when you have to do certain things, but 90 days before your event. You also need to go in and do your DUNS, get your DUNS number and register, do your SAM registration that I mentioned earlier. Once you've done that, you've completed your application, you've done all of that stuff, the application goes to the DVET, to the state director level. And the state director and the regional office are going to review that application. As Shirley mentioned, you shouldn't be sending anything directly to the national office. Your communication is with your DVET first. So the DVET and the state, they're going to look through that application, and then they're going to pass it on to the national office where Shirley is located to review your application. If your application is approved, then you will get a notice of award, a letter from the grant officer saying that you've been awarded the grant. At this point, if you'd like to be included in our registry of stand-downs that I mentioned, you can also notify us. And then somebody had asked for a link of where to register those. I'll try and show that at the end of the presentation of where you can register your stand-downs. So you've gotten your notice of award, and what you're going to get is a personal identification number, a PIN number, which is your password for eGrants, which is the system that's going to help you process your grants, and also a form to help you set up your payment management system account. And this is where you'll be able to actually draw down your funds, to access your funds, and do all those sorts of things. So you'll get a form that you need to complete that helps you set up that fund, that helps you set up that account. And you should use something that you can track to return that form. So FedEx, UPS. It says non-U.S. Postal Service, but you can use the Postal Service if you're using one of their tracking. Don't use regular snail mail, but you could, if you're using one of the Postal Service's priority mail or one of those things, you could use that. Because you're going to return that form back so that you can start actually drawing down your funds. Then you would draw down your funds, and then there are reporting requirements too that we'll talk about in just a minute. So that's the basic process of how to apply for the grant. So let's look a little bit more in detail about what the application actually looks like and what you have to include in the application. You need to have a memorandum that's actually requesting the funds, asking for the funds, and it needs to be signed in blue ink. This is taken directly from the Federal Register notice. That's why I encourage you to read it even after going through this webinar. But it does say it must be signed in blue ink. Then you're going to need to do a program narrative. And your program narrative includes a bunch of components here. You need to include the geographic area that you're going to serve, an estimated number of the homeless veterans that you're going to serve at your stand down. As I mentioned earlier, you need to have a system for how you're going to track which of those participants that come to your stand down are homeless veterans versus non-homeless veterans, or perhaps other homeless folks who are not veterans. So you need to have a way to track that. You also need to talk about the role that your American Job Center staff is going to play. And that could be the DVOCs that I mentioned earlier, or it could be some other staff member from the American Job Center. But you need to talk about what role they are going to play in your stand down. You need to talk about the activities that you are going to have at your stand down. That includes those core components that I mentioned earlier, that the AJC participation, the VA Medical Center participation, and the emergency shelter referral. Those things have to be included. but any other activities that you're going to have need to be included as well. You also need to include a timeline for your stand down. So when are things happening? What is happening? When is it happening? You want to be very explicit about that. You also need to include a section in here about any challenges that you anticipate in hosting your stand down, and then the possible solutions. So maybe a challenge might be getting homeless veterans to the location, and a possible solution might be partnering with a local agency who's going to provide shuttle bus service or something to the location. So that's part of your program narrative. So you need to think about all of those things. You also need to have your SF-424, which is your financial document, and that also needs to be signed in blue ink. You need to have the SF-424A, which is your budget narrative. And your budget narrative needs to, again, explain everything that's in your budget. And it needs to explain it, you can't just say miscellaneous expenses. If things are on the miscellaneous line, in the 424, in your narrative you need to explain what that miscellaneous item actually is. So you need to be really clear about what you're doing there. I want to go back for just a second on the timeline to help you think about something here. When you're thinking about the timeline for your event, you want to think about planning for your stand down in 3 phases. The first is the planning phase, so getting everything together. The second phase is the execution, that's the event itself. And the last phase is the follow-up, so what happens afterwards. And that would include your reports and when you're going to submit your reports to the DVET. Also, if you need to draw down any funds in advance, you would want to explain that in your timeline and why you need to do that. So make sure your timeline is as detailed as possible, and also that everyone knows the timeline, because when you go to draw down your funds, when you can do that is going to be dependent on what your timeline says and the date of your event. So in addition to your budget narrative, you also need to have that SAM registration that we talked about earlier. You need to have at least 4 letters of support for your stand down. 3 of them are connected to those core basic services. The first one, the letter of support coming from your American Job Center or DVOP about how they're participating. The second one is the letter of support coming from your VA Medical Center about their role in your stand down event. The third letter of support is coming from whichever partner, that could be your own agency, another part of your agency, or another provider of emergency shelter. Remember, that referral to emergency shelter is a required element of your stand down, and so you need to have that partner identified, and they need to provide a letter of support stating that they will do that. And then your fourth one can be from some other partner that you're working with in the community who's going to be part of your stand down event. So again, at least 4 letters of support, and 3 of them need to come from those core service providers. You also need to have, if it applies to your particular organization, approval of your nonprofit status from the IRS if you are a nonprofit. There is an option this year to use a consolidated stand-down application. It combines a few of these documents that we've just talked about into one document. It's called Appendix C. And in the link that I gave you and that you'll see again later to the stand-down resources on the DOL-VETS website, you will see Appendix C there, and you can actually click on that, and it will combine a couple of these documents into one place. So on the finance and reporting side, a couple of key dates and timelines to keep in mind, and again, I will show you that timeline piece in just a minute. You need to draw down all of your funds within 90 days of your stand-down event. So 90 days or sooner, all of the money has to be drawn down. You need to submit your SF-425, which is your your financial reports no later than 30 days after the end of each federal quarter, fiscal quarter, while your stand-down funding is, while your application is still happening. So depending on when you get your funding and when your stand-down event happens, you may have to submit more than one SF-425 at the end of each federal fiscal quarter. And I'll show you the timeline in a second, and that will make a little more sense. And then your final SF-425, which is your final financial report, is due no later than 30 days after the end of the fiscal quarter in which all of your funds have been drawn down. And at that time, when you submit your final SF-425, you also need to submit your post-event report to your DVET. So you have a financial report, and then you have a post-event report that you're submitting as well. I'm going to pause for a second and pull up that timeline that I mentioned. Bear with me just a second. So this document is available for you in the handouts section on your screen. When you see that handout, it's called Stand Down Timeline. Feel free to download all of these handouts. But this gives you a sample timeline of how the process works. This assumes that you are applying, that your stand-down event is going to be on July 1st of this year. And it's divided into 3 separate timelines because it's 3 different functions. So the blue timeline across the top is the application part, how you're applying for stand-down funding. The red part is how you're drawing down the funds if you've been awarded, and the green part is how you're submitting reports. So if you look across the top at the blue timeline, you're going to see that we're assuming here that your stand down is July 1. Sorry for my not so neat highlighting there. Your stand down is July 1, 2016. So on January 1st, this is the earliest you can submit your application. It's 6 months before the date of your stand down. That's the earliest you can apply for funding, is 6 months before. You need to make sure your SAM account is active, and you need to make sure that it's going to be active and current through the day of your stand down. So it's not enough for it just to be active when you're applying. It needs to be active through the day of your stand down event. So in this case, we applied on January 1st. That's the earliest we could apply. It usually takes 60 days or less to hear back. Sometimes if you are busier, I'm sure Shirley would attest to that, than others, but it usually takes 60 days or less. So if you submit it on January 1st, by March 1st, you should know if you've been awarded. You have to submit by May 1st for a July 1, okay? That's the latest you can actually apply for it. So that's the application side of things. I'm going to erase that because it's a little distracting and come down to drawing down the funds. So again, we're assuming our July 1 stand down. On March 1 is when our funds are available, 120 days before the event itself. That's when I can do it. That's also when I got my PIN and my financial password so that I actually have the ability to draw down funds. When you're drawing down funds, you can only draw down a fund, you can only draw down money within 3 days of the actual expense. So I can't draw down money on March 1st that I'm not actually going to use until May 1st. Okay? But if I'm using if I'm paying for something on May 30th, I can draw it down on the 27th. So 3 days. If you submit any expenses for your stand-down that are not approved for any reason, they must be returned within 15 days. That's what this one is. And the last piece here, as I mentioned, is in this case, if the stand-down is July 1st, you have to draw all your funds down by October 1st. That's 90 days after your event. And then our last piece down here is reports. In this case, it's a July 1st stand down. Again, there's your July 1st stand down. You don't have to do anything at the beginning here because nothing has happened. But on April 30th, you're going to have to submit your first of those SF425s for any expenses that you occurred in the first quarter. So from January 1 to March 30th. In this case, you didn't get your money until March 1st. That's when you received your funding. So you would be covering the period from March 1st to March 30th in this first report here. The end of that quarter is June 30th. Your stand down is on the 1st. On July 30th, you're submitting your next SF425 for any expenses that were occurred in the second quarter between April 1 and June 30th. The end of the third quarter happens on September 30th, and on October 30th, you're submitting your final expenses for anything from July 1 through September, and your post-event report is going to your DVET on that same day. So hopefully that gives you a better picture of those dates and those timelines. And again, that handout is available here in the handout section for you to download and use as much as you need. Also in the handout section here, there's another one-page document that shows you what the allowable and disallowable expenses are. You can download that. Then there's also a guide on stand downs that you can download as well. So please feel free to download any of those materials as you wish and as you need. They're there for you. Okay, so back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so back to the resources portion of our PowerPoint. As you can see here, there's a bunch of website resources that I had referred to earlier that you can find. The DVET directory, there's a link here to that where you can find who your DVET is. The stand down guide I just mentioned is in the handout section. This link will help you find the DVOP in your area. If there isn't a DVOP, you can go through the American Job Center directly. This is a link to the HVRP grantees. If you are not an HVRP grantee and you are planning a stand-out event, I urge you to connect to the HVRP grantees. HVRP is another program of the Department of Labor. It stands for Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. And the purpose of the program is to connect homeless veterans with competitive employment. So they're a great partner for your stand-down, especially on the employment services sides of things. There's the link to the federal notice, Federal Register notice I mentioned, the link to finding your DUNS number, and then lastly, your link to do your SAM registration. All of those things are there. And I promise I'll stop with the highlighter for now, the bright yellow highlighter. So at this point, what I'm going to do is pause for a second and pull up. I know we've had quite a few questions, and I'm going to pause and see if I can, which ones are for Shirley and which ones are for more general questions, and we'll see what where we can go from there. Just a second. As I mentioned, one of the questions was about will there be access to the PowerPoint slides in the presentation? That there will be access to those on our website, and also in a follow-up email with that survey, there will be a link to the recording so you can see the entire webinar. One point to clarify, when you're doing your timeline, you do want to put in your timeline when you want your first drawdown to be. Make sure that that's part of your timeline when you want your first drawdown to be, just to make sure that when you're talking with your DVET, they're going to want to go through that. Let's see what other questions we have here. Shirley, we have a question about how active the DVET and the /GOTR are in the process. Would you like to talk about that for a minute, what their role is?
Yes, they walk you, they actually hold your hand, especially if you're new to the programs. They walk you through the entire process. There is no question that is stupid, especially if you're new at doing these programs, because they want to get it right, because once it leaves them to come here, I process it instantaneously. So they walk you through every step of the way. And if you're not comfortable with talking with them, if you go to the directory, look up their name, you can send them an email. They will get right back to you. There is no hold up on this process.
Thank you, Shirley. I also had a question, just wanting to clarify about submitting your HHS PMS account form. That's when you're awarded that form that you need to return so that you can draw down funds. Please do that as soon as possible, and that's partially why we recommend FedEx, UPS, or like a priority mail that goes overnight, because it can take a couple of weeks to set those accounts up. So it's important that the sooner you get that information back, the sooner that account can get set up, and the sooner you can draw down funds. Let's see what else we've got. There's a question about someone who's having a stand down in January of next year. So January of 2017 would be the next fiscal year. Shirley, when would you suggest that they apply for their funding for a January 17 stand down event date?
In October. In October.
And that would be the 90 days?
Yes.
So 90 days before your event of January 1, if it's January 1, then October 1.
In other words, I will receive it, I will start processing it, I will just hold it until it's time to go. But October will be a good time.
And again, I would encourage those folks who have stand downs of early next year to connect with their DVETs as well as far as timelines to get that processing started. Let's see. There was another question about homeless veterans, serving homeless veterans versus veterans who are not homeless. Again, your stand down can serve both groups of people, but the funding from the Department of Labor needs to go towards supporting homeless veterans. So you may have other sources or other sources of funding or volunteers or other things that can help support those other participants in your stand down event. While I'm thinking of it, I had promised to give an update on DoD surplus items available through the VA. Some of you who've applied for stand downs, who've run stand downs before, know that there used to be a warehouse of DoD surplus items that could be requested for giveaways to homeless veterans at stand down events. Unfortunately, back in February, there was a fire in the warehouse that actually housed those surplus items, and my understanding is it was a total loss, so all of those surplus items were lost. However, if you are looking for surplus items, what you need to do, the new process for now, is you need to connect with the point of contact at your local VA medical center. Whoever the stand-down point of contact is at your local VA medical center, you need to connect with that person, and they can guide you through the process for applying for surplus items directly from the Department of Defense. So again, connect to your VA medical center point of contact, and they can guide you through a process to apply for surplus items directly from the Department of Defense. I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions that have come through. There was one question about the link to the registry, so I'm going to where to register your stand-down event. I'm going to look for that and post that in the chat box in just a second. We have quite a few questions, so bear with me while I look through. Some of them are things we've covered and they've come through. So I'm just looking to see if there's anything we haven't covered. We have a question about how the drawdown works, Shirley. The question is, what exactly are they using to draw down funds? Is it a debit card? Is it an account? Could you speak to how that process works?
That is drawn down from HHS into the account that they set up. Whatever
so it's drawn down into an actual account. It's not on a card, correct?
I'm sorry, repeat that?
It's drawn down into their account that is set up, that HHS account that we mentioned earlier.
That is correct, to their personal banking account from HHS.
All right, we will coordinate it all the way.
Looks like, Shirley, that covers the questions. I'm going to go through, and if any of you asked a question that I haven't answered, we will be going through and I'll be sharing them with Shirley, and we'll collect all of them and make sure that we get answers to all of them to anybody who may have gotten missed here. I do want to thank Shirley for her time in sharing her expertise with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. As I mentioned, please download those handouts that are there. Those are there for you. There will be a survey that pops up immediately following the webinar, or you can get it in an email. It's about 4 or 5 questions. Please take a couple of minutes just to answer that really quickly so we can provide better assistance to you in the future. If any other questions come through, I'll do my best to respond to them through the chat function as well. Thank you all for your time. We very much appreciate it, and thank you for everything that you do on behalf of veterans.
Okay, here we go.